Okay, so thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you to the National Academy for the opportunity to meet with you today to discuss aspects of a report. You will see from my biography that my background is very similar to some of the other speakers this morning, in that I worked in various middle leadership roles in schools before leaving to join the Scottish College for Educational Leadership, which is very much like your National Academy. And now I lecture up at the University of Glasgow, where I would be termed an early career academic, because what we're going to do this morning is draw from the Neil report, and we'll also I'll share some of the findings of my research that I've been doing with middle leaders in Scotland. So what we thought we would do, first of all, is perhaps put in context that study that I mentioned there that I had been doing. So hopefully you'll be familiar with the Neil report, but the study that I was working on was exploring the professional development needs of middle leaders from a small sample from a range of local authorities across Scotland. And we were asking them about their perspectives of their development needs as a middle leader, and their experience and perspectives of the opportunities available to develop their middle leadership. And what we hope to do today is consider that, and also perhaps give some thought to how that might facilitate that further consideration of the implications of that for the roles of middle leaders in Wales, and areas of professional learning that might support middle leaders in schools in Wales. So among the issues discussed in the literature regarding middle leadership in different education systems is that complex nature of the role of middle leadership, and actually the difficulties of finding a definition and perhaps a succinct description of the practice of middle leaders. And in many different systems, it appears that this is a role in transition, particularly that move from the traditional conceptualization of the department head to that wider idea of subject leadership. And one of the issues in some of the early studies was that insularity of departments and subjects, and staff within a particular area might expect their middle leader, for example, to advocate for their subject department, for example, to gain resources, sometimes at the expense of other departments, or to address the concerns of their subject area, often to protect that area from the whole school demands. And the important dynamic there was the relationship between members of the team and the department. And at the same time, there were expectations from senior leaders that middle leaders was about holding teachers to account, that aspect of line management, which has emerged in some of the discussion this morning. However, it's now recognised that the role of the middle leader is much wider, and that middle leaders contribute to those whole school priorities that we've talked about today. And that actually, even further than that, they contextualise those priorities within their areas of responsibility for the people that they are leading directly. They're involved in the development of staff, which has come through as a theme this morning, and they play a crucial role in improving the learning and teaching. So in contrast to that insular approach that we mentioned in the first section there, Salmons in 1997 argued for the importance of forging links across subject departments if the school wants to develop and improve those conditions for learning. So for us then, today, we're going to argue that middle leadership is about building connections. As we know, it's come through in the discussion today, middle leaders are that connection between school leadership and teachers, but also between the strategic development of the school and the life of the classroom. So there's that vertical connection. In addition, they're also the connection between different curricular areas and the different functions and provision across the school. So for example, you might have curriculum leadership along with the leadership of additional support needs or pastoral care or working with families. And increasingly that idea of middle leadership as a team is beginning to be explored. And further, there's that greater emphasis on the leadership dimension of this role in improving those conditions for effective learning. And we're arguing here that that's about both pupils and staff. So in the next few slides, I'm going to consider aspects of professional development that middle leaders might require in order to equip them for that role. And it articulates well with some of the discussion that we've already had this morning. So there's an increasing recognition of the need for appropriate professional development and support to develop the knowledge, skills and capacities of both aspiring and serving middle leaders, to both equip them for their role and ensure that their ongoing development. In time gone by, excellence in pedagogical practice might have been viewed as the prerequisite for promotion to a middle leader role. But we now recognise that although that's important, it's not enough. As we've discussed already, middle leaders also need a preparation which equips them with the skills required to lead departments and faculties, to contribute to whole school planning and development, and also to lead and nurture the professional development of others. It's widely recognised that the professional learning needs of teachers are unique to them and that they change with time, and the same is true of middle leaders. It's also recognised that the workload of middle leaders can be challenging, and we have discussed that today. It's that balance of that significant teaching commitment with those leadership management responsibilities that we talked about. So the professional learning for our middle leaders needs to be appropriate to those individual needs, but it also needs to be flexible. And what we've kind of suggested in the report is that could cover a number of areas. So there could be those course-based programs that some middle leaders mentioned that have the opportunity to engage with already today. And those courses might have a practice focus, which provides those opportunities for middle leaders to reflect on their practice. But also that learning from leadership experience. So those aspiring middle leaders that John might have referred to today as junior middle leaders, particularly when it's combined with mentoring and coaching, can provide that highly individualised approach that we mentioned earlier. There's also that notion of inquiry, which some of our middle leaders mentioned actually in their discussions this morning. And these could be conducted within the school context and could be a vehicle through which teachers might be inspired to be instigators and drivers of that whole school improvement and change. But that can also provide them with valuable leadership learning, that taking forward of inquiry and change. And we could argue actually that the school has a natural cycle of action and reflection in that regard. And that, for example, practice-based learning might actually support that participation in reflecting on practice, identifying areas for improvement and taking them forward. So what we thought we would do now is explore some aspects of that discussion a bit further. And specifically, I thought I would look at school improvement, collaboration and reflection. And this is where I might draw from some of the data for my fairly small scale study in our discussion. So in terms of improvement, as we've all recognised in our discussion today, that day-to-day involvement of middle leaders in learning and teaching means that they're often the closest to learning and teaching, perhaps even more so than some of our more senior leaders in the school. So that positions them quite uniquely to identify those areas for improvement, to implement the change within their area of responsibility, and also help inform aspects of that change. So middle leaders, therefore, and this is cropped up in some of our middle leader discussion today, they've got the potential to be at the forefront of that bottom-up approach to change. They can harness the perspectives of those at the forefront of learning and teaching, their colleagues in their teams. And that approach could ultimately contribute to achieving a shared vision and a shared sense of ownership of the improvement. However, we perhaps should recognise here the research of people like Gurran Drysdale, who who remind us that the extent to which middle leaders can contribute to whole school improvement is very much dependent on the culture of the school, and that is set by senior leaders. In the study that I undertook with Scottish middle leaders, I found that many middle leaders understand that whole school dimension of their role quite well. Some very established middle leaders with no wish to progress to more senior roles actually said that they would welcome more opportunities to be involved in whole school strategic decision making to inform and support their work, and to learn about some of the wider issues that underpin those whole school decisions, and also to better understand the work of others like pastoral care or people who are engaging with our parent community. And some schools did provide that opportunity, in fact, by offering extended leadership teams in which teams came together with senior leaders to be involved in that whole school strategic decision making within the school. But in terms of delivering improvement, section 7 of our report, Developing Middle Leadership in Wales, cites authors such as Gunter and Rutherford, who argue the need to develop middle leaders as researchers able to support the systematic gathering and analysis of data about teaching and learning, and theorisers who are able to identify meaning in that data and implement changes in practice. And Harris, Busher and Wise also observed that an encouragement to analyse and scrutinise data and evidence are among some of the features of training that is most likely to result in a change in leadership practice. And in the study that I undertook, some of our Scottish middle leaders, particularly those more recently appointed, were beginning to identify data literacy as an important area for their professional development. Some had participated in courses to develop those skills, and they recognised that relevant data could help inform those areas for improvement and also facilitate the monitoring of any interventions that they put in place to deliver improvement. So things were mentioned like monitoring and tracking pupil progress, handling management information systems as well. It is possible within our Scottish context that government agendas have helped to raise the profile of this aspect of work, because Scotland has quality assurance frameworks which encourage the generation of evidence to inform and measure improvement. So moving on to the next section, the other area that I wanted to discuss was this whole issue of collaboration. And we again speak about this, we allude to this in the report. But as you may be aware, features of collaborative cultures might include aspects such as professional reading, professional dialogue with colleagues, sharing practice with peers and leaders, student feedback and coaching. And research from Seashore, Louis and Lee suggests that the organisational learning and change is more likely to occur in that collaborative culture, in which collaboration, reflection, and a willingness to try new approaches or perhaps even take collective risks is more of a cultural norm. And significantly, as we have discussed today, and we'll mention it again, that success of middle leaders can depend on that culture of the school. But in the study of Scottish middle leaders, the significant influence of leaders in the development of the aspiring leaders was strong. Discussing their development as a leader, every participant reflected back to the early stages of their leadership journey and described the influence of another leader, usually identifying an individual who had had a particularly significant impact, and that person was often a middle leader. The actions of that middle leader ranged from encouragement to consider a middle leadership pathway to modelling inspirational leadership. There was also informal nurturing in a kind of mentoring capacity from some of our middle leaders, and the support of critical friends whom they could have honest conversations with. And I suppose I should also mention here that some people also stated that they had learned how not to lead from what they had viewed and perceived to be the poor practice of another leader. So in terms of professional learning for middle leaders, that reinforces the need for those opportunities in which aspiring and developing middle leaders can learn from other leaders. But it also reinforces some of the previous assertions this morning about the need for middle leaders and other leaders to have both the skills and opportunities to be able to develop that leadership capacity of others. Another aspect of collaboration that was really interesting was the leadership style of the middle leader. And in a couple of cases that I looked at, the collaborative leadership style was identified as significant in developing the leadership capacity of others. So middle leaders with a collaborative leadership style might be described as transparent in their approach. They were happy to share the thinking that had informed their work and their decision-making and their planning. And aspiring middle leaders found it beneficial to observe how a range of tasks, and sometimes challenging tasks actually, were handled. They had the opportunity to understand the factors that had influenced the decisions that were made and appreciate the values that had informed the middle leader response in certain situations. To expand that out a wee bit, in collaborative teams, the middle leaders were very willing to learn from the expertise of others within that team. So team members were encouraged to lead in specific areas or to lead specific initiatives where they had a particular talent or strength. And in doing so, they knew that they could approach the middle leader for advice and support. And this provided them with individualized and supported leadership experience at that early stage in the leadership journey. It also allowed them to be at the forefront of taking forward some of those improvement and priorities that had been identified by the team. So to move on to our final slide, to my final slide, sorry, Christine's going to take over shortly. The final area that I wanted to talk about was that importance of critical reflection. And you can see from the screen there that a number of authors, Glover, our esteemed colleague, Alma Harris is with us today. They argue the importance of reflection to transferring new knowledge to the workplace, learning from experience, and professional growth and learning. We've discussed that in the report, but also to draw from the small scale study that I had done. It certainly confirmed a lot of the literature in terms of the value of award-bearing programs, the value of individualized approaches such as coaching, and opportunities to reflect on practice which those experiences provided. But what I did think was particularly interesting, Flukiger propose alternative learning pathways for middle leaders. They look at the need to develop those who intend to progress to more senior leadership roles and suggest that a more strategic focus is required for those leaders. And they also suggest that there should be a dedicated pathway for those who plan to remain in middle leader roles. And that pathway might include, in their case, they were talking about the development of teacher leadership. So they're talking about developing knowledge and skills that enable them to facilitate and nurture teacher leadership. But for established and experienced Scottish middle leaders who wish to remain in their role, professional learning communities, opportunities, I should say, often comprised of meetings of subject specialists or training courses to support initiatives or priorities that had been organised by the local school authority. In some cases, a lot of training was provided by our Scottish Qualifications Authority, who are our examination board, and I was looking at secondary school middle leaders. So this was viewed as an important part of their role, ensuring that there was a good understanding within the team of the examination requirements. The only other thing that was on offer occasionally was perhaps an opportunity for an established middle leader to hear an inspirational speaker. And one middle leader talked about the opportunity that they'd had to go and hear a former Olympian, actually, discussing motivation and achievement. And the impact of the key messages that that participant took from that inspirational talk prompted his reflection about how he might apply some of those principles in school. And it resulted in a very successful departmental initiative that really engaged pupils and was shared across the school. However, if you think of the other opportunities that I have just mentioned for our established middle leaders, they are very much led by our local authorities in the implementation of an initiative, our qualifications board in sharing, for example, examination requirements. And I think there's a danger here that rather than prompt reflection, they focus largely on the transmission of information about aspects such as the implementation of a national or local priority. And although these opportunities will support specific tasks, if professional learning for middle leaders focuses only upon opportunities such as this, then it could position those experienced and established middle leaders as vehicles for implementing the vision of others, rather than developing them as creative thinkers who could identify that need for change and implement relevant and creative solutions that will improve learning and teaching to benefit the pupils. So I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I'm now going to hand over to Christine. I have control of the slides, Christine, so if you want to just give me a prompt when you want a slide change.
Right, thank you. We're going to now turn to the work we've been doing in relation to the Welsh system. This project was part of a wider Tri-Nations project that we have been doing with Wales, the Republic of Ireland and Scotland. Before the pandemic struck, we had a great symposium in Mawrth in Ireland with representatives from Scotland, from Ireland, and indeed Tegwin had a team from Wales with it. And we really kind of thrashed out a lot of issues around middle leadership at a policy level, at a research level, at a practice level with it. And prior to that symposium, I'd done some work with Scotland and Ireland looking at the policy evolution of ideas around middle leadership. It was something that had been of interest to me as I thought back over my career of how significant middle leadership had become. So largely then, this was the Welsh element of that study, which is to look at the evolution of middle leadership. And one of the areas that's of interest always to me are the contrasts between different systems. There's long-standing subject leader posts in Wales and Scotland, not so in Ireland. Ireland are trying to grapple with kind of looking at middle leadership teams just now. And in Scotland, we have had many, kind of articulations, including the standard for middle leadership, which I'd argued for strongly. But there's still kind of a lack of clarity about what it actually means to be a middle leader day to day. And I thought the 4 presentations from the field, from the middle leaders, absolutely shaped a kind of understanding about the lived experiences. So what I was interested in was, I'm interested in are the policy expectations around middle leadership and the lived experiences. And is there a gap? Are there kind of tensions and issues here? So what I'm going to talk about are some of those policy expectations. We did a thorough survey of policies. We looked at a whole range of documents, including ystod annual reports, things like pay reviews, etc. And one of the things that struck me coming from the outside of the system was the fact that there was a common idea around leadership at all levels. And it was a very broad, generic issue. It was about building leadership capacity across the system. But my focus was particularly on middle leadership. And it was how this was being envisaged in this kind of generic statements around leadership, particularly in the standards, teaching and the standards for teaching and leadership, but also in schools in Wales as learning organisations. And similarly, the curriculum for Wales mentions the importance of leadership, the importance of people having agency, the importance of taking forward change. And what we've got here on the left-hand side are the kind of key themes that emerged, particularly from the kind of three key current documents. We can look historically as well as in terms of the current documents. And those ideas about leadership at all levels, which is a common policy theme across the three systems. But there was really mention of the importance of leadership, of professional learning by middle leaders, that they have a really important role. This was mentioned, wasn't huge, but it was mentioned there. These three policy texts really look at Wales as a changing system. So there was mention of the importance of leadership and actually leading those changes both in terms of the profession, in terms of schools, and in terms of what's been delivered to the pupils with it. And it did pose questions about the professional development of aspiring and serving middle leaders. But there was a question about what was the purpose of that. And I think Kathleen and I feel strongly that middle leadership has got an integrity of its own. It's not just a staging post to senior leadership. It has an integrity of its own. It has a massive contribution to the school as a layer of leadership. I accept that it is part of the succession planning that systems need to do, but I think we really have to respect middle leadership as a core layer of leadership within the programme, within any school leadership programmes. Could you turn on to the next one? Thanks, Kathleen. One of the things we did find was that, especially in the Estin reports, that they remarked upon the lack of clarity about the role, but that's a finding across many, many different systems, Malaysia, Australia, Britain, systems here in Britain. And what we were trying to do was draw from all of that policy analysis to try and say, right, let's conceptualize this. Let's conceptualize this, I suppose, in terms of where we see middle leadership having that integrity. And that integrity is about leadership of learning and teaching, but it's also leadership for learning and teaching, and it's also leadership by learning. And for me, these are different facets of this role of middle leadership. And what we were trying to do here was not kind of stick another adjective in relation to leadership, but trying to bring forward and make more coherent a model around what should middle leadership be thinking of? What are the different variants of leadership that are actually encompassed in this broad role and this connecting role that we see as middle leadership having? So at the core of it is about leadership of learning and teaching, but to exercise that, there has to be collaborative leadership. Kathleen has highlighted the importance of that. There also has, to our minds now, particularly as we look at new curricula, a social justice leadership, and that means a concern for the learning of all learners. So any decision that is made, any actions that are taken, has to understand and begin to explore the impact for all learners. How do we cater for that? We are in a moment of change, both in Scotland. We're revising and reviving the curriculum for excellence in Wales. Similarly, there's the need for change, and there's a lot of change going on. So it is about transformative change, that change is being realised, and it's being realised productively. And for us, though, the hidden aspect was curriculum leadership. It was there implicitly, but it seems to be utterly essential as we go forward, both in Scotland and in Wales, and indeed we were talking about it in relation to Ireland. Next slide, please. So I want to kind of spend a little bit of time about curriculum leadership. Curriculum leadership was a concept I remember from my early days in leadership development, but it kind of fell off the agenda. We talked more about transformational leadership or leadership for learning as kind of looking at pedagogy But I don't think we can get away from pedagogy, understanding pedagogical content knowledge, understanding the need for curricula to translate those pedagogical actions into experiences with it. So my view is that we should begin to refocus on some of those specific skills and activities that are related to designing, delivering, and evaluating curriculum with it. So, and therefore, middle leaders who are close to the classroom but are also got understandings about the strategic development of the institution are absolutely key in doing this. And this, I think, we've talked quite a lot about secondary, but I think this is equally important in the primary sector. We need to kind of keep a focus on that. We're not shaped by history here and looking at curriculum leadership as subject leadership solely. I think it's a lot more varied with it. So for me, curriculum leadership then is really important in leading those processes of design and development. And there's, for me, sets of technical skills there about how you look at curriculum, how you look at things like pace, about pedagogy, about differentiation, how you grapple with these, because if you are genuine in ensuring a curriculum for all learners, you need to take these into account. So how are we developing that? There's been some work done, particularly by Mark Priestley from Stirling University here in Scotland on the Curriculum for Excellence. He's really led some of the research, but also the development work in schools. And in one of their reports, they talk about pockets of expertise, and I really liked that. I really thought that when we look at teaching as a deeply contextualized practice, the experts are those teachers who deal day to day with children. There was an interesting study done by David Berliner on excellent teachers, where they tried to take the teachers, these excellent teachers, out of their classrooms to deal with other classes. And some of them found it incredibly hard because they didn't know the school that they were, this new school, they didn't know the pupils. They had to work very hard to develop the expertise that they actually had. So that expertise, both what Shulman talks about, pedagogical content expertise, but also insights into the pupils and the pupils' needs and the pupils' learning, the pupils' preferences, etc. These are the pockets of expertise that we actually have to tap into. Teachers know understanding about how we teach something specifically, how it works for that group or how it works for that group. So there's part of the role of middle leadership is to engender and draw from those pockets of expertise, that teachers can make sound decisions about how they are shaping and delivering the curriculum with it. The other part of that then is establishing and guiding development teams and teaching teams. One of the best definitions I ever had read of curriculum, and it dates me, was written in 1981 by the Schools Council in England. And it said that the curriculum was the sum total of all the experiences a child has in the school. And that kind of brought me up short because I was used to writing programs of study for pupils, etc. And when you think about it in those kinds of terms, it is more about thinking about how we use the curriculum, how we design the curriculum, how we deliver the curriculum to shape the conditions for effective learning for all learners. And it's those conditions of learning. Are we getting them right? And that's where we tap into teachers' agency. But we also then have to do that collectively, because we have to look at the conditions of learning within classrooms, across the school. And again, middle leaders have really an important role. We heard from middle leaders in Wales about the importance of reflection, of asking questions, looking at the experiences of young people. And so for me, then, design and delivery is part of it, but also kind of inquiry pedagogies. If we are trying out stuff, let's think about it hard. Let's talk about it hard. Let's think about what does this actually mean? what does this mean for us as teachers, but what does it mean for these children, for this group of young people? What kind of impact is it having on those individuals? So for me, part of the core of middle leadership, I think, both in Scotland and in Wales, as they are grappling with the curriculum, is really centred upon this, but not just the written programme. It is about these lived experiences. It is about these conditions for learning. Next, thanks, Kathleen, for that. So for us then, it's really, I suppose, drawing together some of these ideas around middle leadership and really thinking about how middle leaders take forward what is, I think, a very complex and varied role. You know, it is contextualized. I think there are significant differences between middle leadership in the primary sector and middle leadership in the secondary sector. I think there are significant differences between middle leaders in a small primary school and middle leaders in a large primary school. Scotland, Ireland and Wales do share a common feature of having many rural and small primary schools. So it's not an insignificant part of the system that we have to consider here as well with it. So it is working around some of these contextual variations to begin to think about how is middle leadership taken into action. First one, as Kathleen had talked about, is working with teachers. And that closeness that they have to the classroom is a real asset here. But it's about how you build what Edward Groves talks about is relational trust, that you're a trusted person as a leader. And I think trust is one of the really important key aspects of any leadership role, that you're looked at with credibility, you know, as somebody with credibility, somebody who has solid values at their heart, and that you are about building relationships. John talked about earlier about that knowledge of communication. And I think there is a knowledge base there, but there is also sets of personal and interpersonal skills that become really important there. And there are sets of values that have to inform that collaboration. Collaboration doesn't happen yesterday. This is growth. It's growth on behalf of the teachers. It's growth on behalf of the middle leaders who are facilitating this. There's still a tendency towards an expectation of transmission learning. And by that I mean is that an expert will come in, or somebody in the school has got expertise in and will tell people about it. And people will then go and translate it or not translate it into their classroom. Now, transmission learning or modelling is one aspect of learning. For me, what you're working with teachers is about co-producing ideas. It's working on, I've tried this out in my classroom, or you've tried that in your classroom. How did that go? How did that go? How do we see this? And for me, the middle leadership role is really critical in drawing together, synthesizing these experiences through genuinely collaborative processes. And so collaboration in this regard is really collaborative learning. We are learning through this together. And from these experiences, we can then begin to make decisions about our aim, all of those technical skills around curriculum for leadership that I talked about. And central there is, of course, assessment. And assessment is an important developmental tool, as well as something that we, clearly need within the system. Helen Timperley talks about the real importance of assessment as a means of identifying what teachers need to learn further and what they need to do further with it. Assessment is for learning is a great tool for feedback to the learner, but it's also using assessment as a process of reflection, of analysing experiences of the young people to see if the conditions for learning are really important there. And Timperley, who does underline some of the importance of inquiry pedagogy, said, in many ways, when you are undertaking these developmental processes, we've got to start with thinking about thinking about what we're getting from the assessment of pupil learning. often the process of, I was involved in this for a long number of years. There's an initiative that comes out, you do lots of CPD, then you expect teachers to kind of begin to translate that into their classroom. But they don't start with, so what do the children need? And that's why looking at the outcomes of pupil learning become important for shaping the professional development of learning. The other one is, and this is something that I think, has clearly come very much to the surface, but it's an area that we have, it has been central in the standards in Scotland around the importance of social justice as a set of values. Way back in a very early iteration of the standard for headship in the late 90s, we talked about the importance of equalities and the importance of all learners. And I think we've learned far more about that. We're learning far more about the exercise of social justice leadership. I'm lucky enough to be part of an international research project on this. I'm beginning to understand that we need to understand far more from the lived experiences of different groups of learning, the increasingly diverse groups of learners that we have. And it's that hard look, those pockets of expertise that we have to enable teachers to build up these understandings. And again, middle leadership roles, it's not just saying, oh, have we got something for example, boys, etc., or have we got something for this particular group? It's actually looking far more closely about what are the outcomes for these? What are the barriers to their learning? How are we going to take those apart? How are we doing something about it, both institutionally and within classrooms? And ultimately, for me, then, middle leadership is about identifying ways to enhance the conditions for learning across all learners with it. And it is about the importance of reflection, but self-evaluation. I know Wales has got a self-evaluation tools to use this. These are really critical in helping us think about what next comes out. Next slide, please. So for us, in summary, it really is about balancing this dual role. I was a middle leader. I was a middle leader in the university, and I did feel like the jam in the sandwich most days, I have to say. But what I learned quickly, though, there were two things. One, it gave me access to the thinking that was going on at a strategic level. But secondly, I was the one who could get things done. Strategy was strategy. My job was to get things done, and I really enjoyed that. And I never lost my teaching role. I refused to give that up. So there are strengths in that. One of the things that we've seen, and Kathleen talked about, the evolution of this across the policies in the three systems that I've looked at. We've gone from middle leaders, subject leaders having particular tasks into this emphasis on leading. And for me, it's about now nuancing that leading role, those organising activities that Scott Ecott talks about. What are those? But central to this is then about building those relationships. It is about, yes, ensuring that the conditions for effective learning are there, but it's only through others that this can be exemplified and actually taken into practice. And the last one is that middle leadership, is about improving those conditions for learning with it. Okay, last slide. And really, these were some of the questions that we kind of posed at the end. We did another presentation for the Academy, but also in the report. So thank you for that. That's us. If there are any questions, I think we tried to finish off within 45 minutes.
Thank you so much. That's been really, really interesting again. And Kathleen, the work that you're still engaged with and doing up there in Scotland, I think will produce further evidence to support the importance of middle leadership. If I could start with a question, and I ask others to put questions in the chat, but to me, the middle leader, it seems, is at this crossroads of the vertical and the horizontal, whereby they're involved with the strategy, as you say, but they're also collaborating and hopefully leading communities of practice to look at school improvement in the main. And how do you see them balancing that role of the strategic and the working with peers in terms of accountability, holding others to account in as a middle leader, say as a head of department?
I mean, that was one of the perennial tensions within subject leadership as well, that there was a sense that subject leaders the expectation on the part of staff that subject leaders should be protecting them in the wider school and that insularity. I think the move towards, and for me, this is one of the aspects that across the three systems is really important. The move towards middle leaders being part of the school leadership team is a major process for me. It is about, and it was my experience as a middle leader that I was part of the strategic leadership of the faculty. But at the same time, I was back in, working with and leading, working on programs, etc. But it is that kind of being part of that bigger decision making, and then being able to say, look, being able to say, right, this is where we're working out within these particular areas, but to bring those ideas and help frame the individual areas. I don't think there is a place these days for independent aisles of excellence, because they pull across the whole institution. They suck away expertise, they suck away resources. And I think there are a greater sense, and you've got a policy on it around schools as learning organisations, that it's not being imposed upon, because middle leaders are consulting with their staff, they are contributing to the strategy, and it's okay, this is our strategy. And the question that middle leaders, I think, have to ask with their staff is, how are we doing? How are we going to do this? And then how well are we doing it? So it's not a crude accountability. It's a collective. This is what we've got to do. We don't have it, it's a bit like, and this is what policy is about. We have to do it. We've got choices of how we do it and how we contextualize it. Kathleen, I don't know.
Yes, Christine, I think you've covered all the theory there. But if I go back, Jeremy, I think what you were asking was about the challenges for middle leaders of holding others to account. And we certainly have a course within our programme. So for middle leaders who decide that they've got the certificate in middle leadership and they're moving on to a master's course, there's a programme that they can do around ethical leadership. And I did not expect when I spoke to some of the middle leaders that those who had undertaken that programme would have let me know about the impact that had on them as individuals. And it had prompted them to think about how they are seen by other people, what their values are, how they convey those values to others. And certainly I was quite interested to see how what had been taught in that programme was able to be used by the middle leaders to inform some of those challenging situations that, again, that the aspiring middle leaders really hadn't been looking forward to. And actually some of them talked about how they'd managed to turn a situation around when they really thought, what are my core values here? What is the relationship that I want to have with this person, and what has got in the way? So certainly some reflection around that. I don't know, Christine, if you would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely.